Welcome to Writing the Rapids, the writing podcast. This week I had the co-editors of PseudoPod and an assistant editor of PseudoPod on for a different kind of episode. I had a great time talking with these three people, and in a moment you will hear them introduce themselves and the wonderful conversation that followed. As always, if you like this show, you can give me a tithe, a little pittance over at patreon.com/WTR. I recently had a piece called The Broken Teeth Diaries published over at X-Ray Magazine, so go check that out. There will be a link in the show notes. And I don't want to put any more time between you and hearing the interview, so here it is.
All right. Well, this is Shawn Garrett. I'm the co-editor of PseudoPod. That means that on the production end of things, we make the sausage. We pick the stories, we buy them, we assign the readers.
I'm Alex Hofelich. I'm the other half of that co-editor team, and I've been involved with PseudoPod on and off for approaching a decade at this point. But I got bumped up to the editorial team, I don't know, a handful of years ago, and it's been fantastic back on the backside, and I enjoy making sausage.
Hi, I'm Karen Bovenmyer. I'm the shiny brand new assistant editor of PseudoPod. I previously had been guest editor for Artemis Rising last year, and before that I was a contributor to PseudoPod, and before that I was an avid listener. So this has been a really fun journey to go from being thrilled by Al's voice to actually getting to have a recorded conversation with Al, and the PseudoPod music thrumming in the background, which I actually had to get up and scream and run around my house a little bit. It was so exciting.
Yeah, that is one of the things about staff meeting is occasionally we have to remind ourselves, oh, we're not just listening to Al.
Yeah.
It's true.
So I guess one of the things that I posted on Twitter a while ago was that writers of fiction and poets are, I think, the only artists in the world left who are willing to work for free. And the fact that you guys pay and have always paid, so long as I've listened. I started listening a long time ago, back when I was in middle school, I think. So was that always part of the plan, and how did that work back then? Now it makes kind of sense with Patreon and whatnot.
Well, it's always been donor based, and PseudoPod started in 2006. It was the first spinoff from EscapePod, which started in 2005. When EscapePod started, it was starting out as token payments, largely out of the editor's pocket. And then as donations started rolling in, started using that and went to $100 flat for every full-length story. Once our donations grew enough, we went to, it's probably been 3 or 4 years now, we raised our rates to the SFWA, Science Fiction Writers Association, professional rate level of 6 cents a word for original stories. And we still pay $100 flat for full-length stories.
Okay, so
reprinting means of full-length.
Mm-hmm. There was a video, maybe a TEDx talk or something with Mallory Ortberg, who started The Toast, and she was talking about how they wanted to pay authors, so they just built that into the funding when they built the site. And I guess the thing I find interesting with regard to payment for fiction or poetry is how many people are starting magazines without that in the plan. But I would be remiss to discourage people from starting literary magazines, just kind of like in general, because it seems like the more is out there, the better. Where are you guys with that idea?
Well, I mean, it would be nice if everybody could get paid for their work, but of course, the reality is that wasn't even true when you weren't talking about the internet. When you were talking about small press publications and things like that, you got paid in copies, and so I mean, I guess if I don't really know what I'd call the standards by which it should be measured, but at a certain point, if a publication lasts, then at a certain point they should start paying a standard rate, and then at a certain point they should start paying professional rates. But I know what you mean in terms of just wanting there to be more product out there. I mean, the thing is, part of it is that podcasting, you cut out the overhead. You're not printing physical copies of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
You're not having to stick to a schedule, a bi-monthly or monthly, God help them, schedule. As you know, in general, the population's interest in short fiction, which has been on the wane since 1950, whatever, continues to drop, and yet you have this new way of getting into people, getting into an audience, which is through audio. So, in a sense, you can argue that you've taken away a lot of the overhead cost, presuming that we're talking about some kind of internet publishing and no physical offshoot, which then hopefully you can fund, you can at least take half of what you've saved there and funnel it back towards the authors. And then, of course, the other half would go towards being able to keep doing it,
Speaking as a publishing author and as a teacher of new authors, I like to say what Merle Lafferty always told me, which is writers die of exposure. Mm-hmm. Which I thought was a good thing. And early in my career, I did submit things for no pay to places that were important to me, like cancer benefit or domestic abuse benefit. And in fact, I still do that sometimes. And then close personal friends who are doing special anthologies, sometimes I will write for free for them. More often, it's more like a reprint. But I encourage my students to hang on to their work because their work has value, and to wait until they get between 9 to 12 rejections for a story before they consider, okay, maybe this one needs to go instead to a lower paying market or a free market, or to really listen to their hearts. If this is a friend that they really care about, or, some cause that's really important to them, or, they just love the people, to go ahead and submit it with not for pay.
Okay. That
I've got
yeah.
I've got a challenge to the market out there that says it can't be done. Nightlight, the Black horror fiction podcast, they just started this year. They started from day one as a one-man band and started paying $30 flat rate for all the stories. So it can be done. At minimum, everybody should at least be paying something. That is a viable model, no matter what.
I like that sentiment. I've found that in my own writing, and maybe it's detrimental to my craft or something, but I find that doing flash fiction, because I can write it so quickly, and because there's so many places out there that publish flash fiction, I almost think of it as like an unpaid internship where I'm building my resume with all these flash pieces so that when I want a longer work published, I can present my resume of previously published work in all of these other places. Which isn't always the best, because there are some places that don't want to know where you've been published before. They just want to see the work based on the merit of itself. What's the PseudoPod model for knowing about an author before they read their piece?
I think Alex and I approach this slightly differently. I generally just tend to read the story. I don't read cover letters. Often I don't look at author name. I just read the piece and decide if I liked it or not, and then move on from there. It's not like I don't ever look at these things, but I don't look at them initially. But on the other hand, there are some authors who we have published before and who we like and who, consistently give us good material. And so Alex is good about making sure those get kind of bumped, in front of me, instead of having to, wade through the slush readers. But in general, I'm more on the end of I read the story and decide if it's good, because there are any number of great writers that I love that turned out lousy stories in their time. I mean, all you need to do is read the third volume of the collected Richard Matheson short fiction, which ends with all these stories that are basically late sales. And what that means is he wrote them back in the day, but he couldn't sell them because they weren't very good. And then after he got his name made, he sold them, off to various collections and things. They were drawer stories. And, it's kind of a crapshoot. I mean, I can understand the desire to want to be able to look at a list of places and go like, oh, wow, well, that person at least knows what they're doing, in terms of having been published in a bunch of different places. But that can be a double-edged sword too. So, Alex, did you want to chime in?
No, I was just going to say, even the rock stars have to hit a payday once in a while. And those drawer stories do a good job of serving that need. But for newer folks, it's heartening to see a good resume, but it doesn't really factor into my decision process.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I also did editing for Mothership Zeta magazine that was the fun and uplifting that we had through Escape Artists. And then I did 4 years of slushing for Nightmare, and then also Year's Best. And for me, it's true as well. Like, the story has to be really strong and really good all on its own. And then other considerations can come into our understanding. So if you've got, like, speaking from my experience as an editor, if I have like 5 slots and I've got 30 stories that I think are pretty good, and say 2 of the stories I would go and have a fist fight with somebody over getting it into one of those 5 slots, because I'm like, I am in love with the story. I don't care. The other 3 slots, say maybe out of those 30 pretty good stories, there's 10 or so that are all sort of vying for that last 3. And, it's like, this one has a really good thing here happening with it, and this one will be great if they just revise the ending a tiny bit. And this one, well, it's not really my taste, but another editor likes it. And when I'm looking through those kinds of considerations, then I look at somebody and I'm like, you know what? This person I have published a story from like 3 times and maybe it's time that this other person who's a new voice that hasn't had a chance, but this story is of equal awesomeness, maybe that's a choice that I make instead. Or I look at it and I'm like, I've published a number of stories about this particular topic lately, but this other thing is a totally new topic that I haven't considered before, or hasn't been in our lineup before. And then that might edge a story a little bit closer to getting one of those last 3 spots. But I don't know. Shawn, Alex, what do you guys think about that?
Well, I mean, that sounds exactly right. I mean, to me, the other kind of elephant in the room then is that past those considerations of is it a good story or not, then comes the qualifier of would it make for a good reading? which is its own thing and specific to what we do. As Karen and Alex have both heard me say this many times, so I apologize for repeating myself. But I still don't know, even if we were able to get the rights to, say, a Robert Aikman piece, whether or not I feel like I'd be able to. It would be worth trying to pull off a Robert Aikman piece on Pseudopod, because he's a very dense writer. You really have to kind of follow on the page. And people process stories differently when they're read to them rather than reading them off the page. I'd say the same thing about Henry James as the other example I always bring up. Would love to do the Jolly Corner, but I don't know. I don't know whether there are aspects of the writing that worry me as to whether it would come across in audio. And so that has to be a consideration after the fact. And occasionally that works the other way around, which is that you read a story and maybe it's not a hit it out of the park story, but on the other hand, it's perfect for audio, and then and so that tends to give it a little bit of a bump up too,
Yeah, you guys have a whole extra cog in the machine. The other thing that I'm interested to hear your thoughts on is horror as genre fiction, because I read a lot of dark, quote-unquote, literary fiction that I would consider horror, and it seems to me as though horror doesn't have the strict guidelines that maybe science fiction or fantasy does. That's, I guess, the end of the thought/question.
Well, horror doesn't require the speculative element, but it can include it. And some of the best stories out there are ones where you can argue whether or not there's a speculative element in the story at all. Like, to go back to a classic example would be The Yellow Wallpaper, or for something more modern, like Paul Tremblay's Head Full of Ghosts. Both of those you can argue whether or not there's a speculative element in either of those. But you can also argue that there absolutely is.
This is something I could probably fill up like the next hour on, because it's been a lifelong back and forth conversation with myself. Because I too read a lot of lit and read a lot of dark lit, and in fact I think we've got, if everything works out, we've got for Christmas, and this is what I warned you about earlier when we were off mic, that my ability to pull things up at memory are always going to be a little tough once they start going, but I'm scrolling down the list now. We've hopefully got for Christmas a Thomas Hardy story. In terms of, so, I know what you mean by dark lit that kind of seems to overslop into the horror area. I go back and forth on how I define genre. I'm not as hardline about it as some are, but I'm not as open borders as others are. I always think of genres as having permeable barriers, and those permeable areas are sometimes where the more interesting stuff happens, and it begins to expand itself. But like I said, I could talk about this a lot, and I think I've kind of lost track of what the initial thing of this was. Was it?
I guess it's just sort of like an idea that I have trouble with, because I have pieces that I could call horror, but didn't necessarily write with the idea that, I'm going to send these to horror magazines. It also seems like maybe the communities around dark lit or horror is different, and the sort of subgenre-ing of different types of darker fiction cause the waters to get muddy, such as Bizarro. I just got like the Bizarro starter pack, and I read it, and it reminds me of horror, but it reminds me of alt-lit, and it reminds me of, people trying to revive Kafka and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to approach this in another way, in a kind of a mechanical way, one of the ways I always think of it is that, and I use this definition a lot to make the distinction between horror and dark fantasy, because I think we see a lot of dark fantasy submissions, and a lot of dark fantasy gets presented in the horror forum. And it's not as if they're cut and dry different, but I do think that, like, you can dilute the impact of say a horror publication or presentation by having a little too much dark fantasy, because in the end you have to remember that people are coming, hopefully with some flexibility, but hopefully they're coming to hear something scary. So I tend to think of horror as stories that are trying to scare, upset, or disturb you. And I deliberately leave it that vague to cover the fact that, In the Penal Colony by Kafka is a very disturbing story. And, any number of dark lit authors are disturbing. And so, you could kind of see them as horror or related. Occasionally we'll do showcases on the podcast, which is a month of something on a theme. So far, certainly done 2 of the science fiction ones. But I have long-term plans for a noir one. I'd like to do one on black comedy, and another on decadent writing. Just to kind of point out that there are points at which all of these genres overlap with horror. They have many of the same elements, and depending on which story you're talking about, they are the main thrust of it is trying to unnerve you or disturb you or bother you in some way.
Okay. I like artist intent as being one of the signifiers of the genre.
Well, and that's a sticky situation there with artist's intent, because as an English master's student, we would always have these big fights over, reader response theory. What is important? Is it the reaction that the text is generating in the reader, or is it the author's intent? And I think that the truth of it lies somewhere in between those things. As an author, like, I would encourage somebody who has always loved genre and read genre and just really enjoys genre, but they have stuff and people are telling you, oh, this is literary, and you're like, okay, my choice is I can submit it to a literary magazine and start making connections there and start meeting people in that area because that's a place I want to grow. Or I can submit it to a place, even if it, a place that maybe even if it doesn't pay, not that literary pays, because usually that doesn't.
No.
But a place that would make my palms sweat. And so I think, what excites you as an author of where you really want to work towards becoming published? Like, I think that's an important consideration. And furthermore, what determines horror and what doesn't? Like, early on, a lot of the stuff that I wrote, especially in school and afterward, was pretty dark. And I didn't really understand that what I was writing was horror. People just kept telling me, this is dark. And then an editor at a conference, and this was my very first publication story, said, hey, I'm doing a horror anthology. Do you write horror? And I'm thinking to myself, oh, I don't think so. But, when you're a brand new author and an editor says, hey, do you write horror? I want you to submit to an anthology. What comes out of your mouth actually is, yes, I do.
Yeah.
And then you run off and listen to 10 years worth of PseudoPod nonstop.
Yep.
And learn exactly what horror is. So, like, PseudoPod taught me what horror is, and Ellen Datlow taught me what horror is. And I've attended her sessions at conferences again and again. And what I love that she says is, horror is a mood. It's a mood that strikes you, while you're reading the book. And I would assume while you're writing the story or the book, you're in this certain place, and that mood is being generated, and that is what we call horror. But I would add personally another distinction, and that is what I was talking about on our Mofongo Nose story that we recently published. horror is also about the choices that the characters make or don't make to change or not change their situation. What is the choice they make? Is it the dark choice? Is there an action that causes something bad to happen? Or, what is the choice or lack of making a choice that the character makes? And I think that is what helps define, okay, yeah, this is a horror story, personally.
Okay. Yeah, because, just to say it, another thing I often say is, there's also just that kind of this idea that by default, if a story has certain elements, it's a horror story. So if it has a vampire in it or it has a ghost in it, then it's a horror story. But, there's an entire history of ghost stories that aren't horror stories. And, if your story is about a vampire bemoaning the fact that, oh, how awful it is to be alive for centuries and woe is me, and, crying into his Elizabethan sleeves and all that. And, technically he's a walking dead man, but that's never engaged with in the story at all.
Yeah.
Then it's not a horror story, it's that simple, or at least to me it is. And for other people maybe it isn't anyway, because they project, past what the story gives them.
Sure. So where is horror right now as a genre? What do you guys see as... Do you see any currents or waves or directions that the genre is going?
Alex and Karen might be better at this than me. I tend to be a looking backwards type of reader, which doesn't mean I don't read modern things, but I don't read much of it. We publish a lot of currently writers who seem to me to be doing good work. I don't know if I'd point them as kind of pioneers of a new style. But I am happy that it seems that the Thomas Ligotti kind of current has taken hold now, and you're beginning to see more of that.
Yeah.
In things. Although that also kind of leads into this weird area where if it's just existential dismay at how awful things are, is that horror? And it's like, well, again, it comes down to what the author's choosing to focus on and how they're choosing to portray it. So I'm gonna sneeze.
Bless you.
But I mean, there are a lot of things happening. Bizarro certainly seems to be happening, but it seems to also occupy a strange area that, at least to me, doesn't line up with a lot of what I think of as horror. My favorite kind of horror tends to be material in which you are starting with the starting point is the average world, and you then distort that in some way or add something to it that but when you're starting with this kind of anything goes, this is a story told from the point of view of a character in a video game that hasn't been played and is sitting on the shelf, or it's like, that's fine, because I like a lot of surrealists and stuff like that, but to me that's missing the identifier of horror, the kind of personal connection identifier that horror needs to pull off being horrifying.
That's interesting.
Go ahead. As a professor, I'm going to always have something to say, of course, because that's how we're programmed. But Alex, did you want to jump in?
Well, horror is in a really good space right now from a market standpoint. There has been a lot more quiet horror that has gotten a lot more attention with things like The Witch and Get Out. And I am really excited to see the number of people who pick up Shirley Jackson after this latest incarnation of The Haunting of Hill House. I'm really excited to see some of the things that come out of that movement. But in the writing end of things, there's a lot of interest in repeating some of that same sort of emotion, coming from literary fiction and also from the weird.
For my part, the 300 stories that were submitted in September that I've been working my way through, I'd say there's a tendency and it's maybe because of the current political climate, but there's a tendency to slip in a little happy note at the end.
Oh, really?
Like the story will be dark, 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 dark. And I'm like, ooh. And then I get to the end and there's a little bit but it might have been okay because of this. It's almost like current writers right now who are trying to chuck out some horror or I need a little something happy to get me through the day.
Yeah.
It seems like right now people might be a little bit looking for something happier. And then the second point that I'd like to make about where I feel speculative fiction is going is, as a professor, I shamelessly use my students to examine questions that I'm interested in.
Absolutely.
I taught a seminar that was, what's the future of genre? And so the first half of the semester, they read, I split them into teams that were sorted by the Hogwarts houses. And each team had to read stories. Everybody was reading different stories from a certain decade. And they had to say, what was it that genre fiction cared about in the 1960s? And so each team came up with a list from the stories they'd read about people were afraid of nuclear fallout, or people were afraid of this. And so they did this they talked about what were people afraid of through the award winners for every decade until the present. And then their homework for the next whole rest of the semester was to design stories that would, quote unquote, fit the things that we're going to be afraid of in the next 10 years. And these were all, 18 to 22 year olds. And so I thought what they came up with was super interesting. And I've seen it reflected because I taught this class a number of years ago and I've seen it reflected in this decade. People are more interested in global stories, fears like the ones Paolo Bacigalupi looks at, body modification fears, genetic fears, starving fears. We're always afraid of
water resources.
Pardon?
Water shortages.
Yeah, water, and then also hurricanes, and big movements of things that are gonna crush us. But it was interesting to see that they wanted to talk about different settings, like settings around the world. Like one team came up with a novel set in Brazil. They wanted to figure out what else was going on outside of the standard genre always being set in, fantasy being set in medieval Europe. So it was interesting. I think that I'm seeing that reflected in some submissions as we're seeing more stories outside of, sort of the lockstep tradition. We're seeing stories of horrible monsters from different cultural traditions, and then stories of difference of people who are different or underrepresented, but that's not the whole point of the story.
Yeah.
They're just a character going through something that's happening that's horrible, but they happen to also belong to an underrepresented group, which I think is cool that the story's not just all about that.
Yeah, I like it when that happens too. I find that it makes the story feel more earnest rather than we have to put in this character so that the story falls in the sort of ideological checklist of the times.
Yeah, I like it. It's like people are people. Hey, look, here's a people that's going through hard times.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was gonna say if there's a thing that we see with some frequency, which I guess would be considered kind of a modern trend, that I also consider maybe something of a dead end, though, is the playing with kind of a metatextual kind of approach, playing with the format of the and I don't mean dead end might be a bit strong, but what I mean is that sitting down. I can think of a story we got, and the story was all about, riffing on the Cabin in the Woods, and the fact that they point out in the Cabin in the Woods that there's always this person that has to be there to warn the people that are coming to the accepted horror scenario beforehand. The old guy that runs the gas station or whatever. But the entire story was about being that guy. And that's not a bad idea, but they never turned it into a horror story. All it was a story about some aspect of horror story. So, in the end, we rejected it. And so you'll see that occasionally. And this is also something that just becomes more apparent to us because, again, we have to present the thing in audio. So, when you see kind of these rather tricky, I haven't read it, but what's the house... what's the book, the horror novel, fairly recent, it kind of devolves into the footnotes and all.
House of Leaves.
House of Leaves.
Yeah.
That sounds like a really cool and excellent read. There's no way we could do that.
Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah. And I'm trusting that it ends up being scary, but I think that's because the author, went, okay, I've got this great, neat idea, and then I got to remember to keep it scary. And instead, other lesser talents come along and I just got this great, neat idea, and they never remember to kind of circle back to the part where, now, how do you make it scary,
Mm-hmm.
So.
That book I think has been mentioned on damn near every episode of this podcast so far. And of course you couldn't do that in audio, and that's something that's been mentioned too, but...
Well, you could do it in audio, but it would need to be an adaptation. You couldn't do a straight translation. There's a bunch of the things with the slow corruption of the document. You would have to do a different version of the corruption of the audio. You've got to make it match the medium. So you could do it. It would require a whole lot of additional work.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's funny because this came into my mind again just recently because they had done on BBC Radio a presentation of Nigel Neal's The Stone Tape, one of my favorite made-for-TV British things from the mid-'70s. And I just happened... They did this about a year ago or so. The original was in the 70s. They did an audio version of it just about a year ago, and I just happened to watch the DVD within this last week, and it brought back to mind that when I heard the audio version, and again, it was it was an audio play. It wasn't a reading because there was no original source text outside of the screenplay. But essentially, anybody listening to it who had never seen the original version would not understand what was happening at the end of that, and they just forgot to figure out a way to make that work. So, there is that problem of audio of, and you can hear all kinds of, I'd much rather listen to a reading of Stephen King's The Mist than, as neat as it was, the binaural radio drama version of it, because the radio drama version of it felt that they had to include all of the descriptions of the creatures and just turn them into dialogue. So it became oh no, a giant bug is crawling up the wall with horrible pink tentacles, and and it's just none of it flowed like it flowed on the page as a piece of writing, and it was their job as adapters to figure out how to pull that off, and they just kind of defaulted to, we'll just put it in the characters' mouths, and it didn't work. So, but yeah, I mean, I guess there might be a way to pull off something like House of Leaves in audio. But again, you'd have to be somebody who was really good at understanding what the text pulled out off,
Sure.
and then somebody who also really understood how audio worked. So
Yeah.
And some things just don't work. Some things don't carry over. That's what I was saying earlier about certain authors. Certain authors are difficult to get across. Maybe if you got the perfect reader, in an audio form. So. It's
I feel like an author can address this question for themselves with their own work. If they're saying, oh, I don't know if I should send this to Pseudopod or not, I think it's a good move to send it to your Kindle and have your Kindle read it aloud to you. Because I've found that, like, when I'm in a super crabby mood and I'm reading something that's been submitted and I'm like, I totally didn't even understand what was going on in this beginning part, and I'm like super mad. And I reread it and I'm like, oh no, I kind of see what's going on. And then I'm like, okay, Karen, just, have Siri read it to you. Like, I'll have my iPhone speak to me the story, or I'll send it to my Kindle and have my Kindle read it aloud to me. And I'll be like, oh no, this actually, yes. Okay. Yeah, no, that is actually pretty good. I was just my brain was not wanting to do it. So I'd say, like, if someone is wondering, is my story a good fit for Pseudopod, have your, little computerized voice read it aloud to you. And if it still, sounds pretty good being read to you by the computer, then, give it a shot.
And an alternate of that is just read it out loud, like
you darn kids.
Darn kids.
So where is there a limit for Pseudopod between a reading and a radio play? Because there's obviously been episodes where there's been multiple readers. There's one story that you guys did a long time ago that had like creepy 8-bit music, and I had to turn it off. Like, that's the only time a horror story has in my near adult life has like ever caused me to really like, oh, I need to change the set and setting.
Kill Screen is such a good story.
That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting call, because when we make the decision to do extra bits of production, oh, this would be great with multiple cast, oh, this would be great with a sound bed, or it tends to be a rare thing, because in the end we just want it, in the end what we want to present is readings of good fiction. And there is a certain strain of listener, and I can totally understand it, who would see anything that we do, whether it be multiple readers or a sound bed or whatever else, as trying to over-egg the pudding, or sweeten the pot, so to speak, or would find it distracting. And so I get that. So we, it's only when we're reading it and it really just seems to cry out. Like we did, what was the story about the woman living in the treetops? Earlier? Yeah, Evitative. That's right. That wouldn't have necessarily been one that seemed to have, been crying out for an audio bed or, audio production on it. And yet, as I read it, I just was like, what's great about this is that its setting is so odd. It's such a this treetop world that this character has to inhabit now. And yeah, you could have just relied on, the author's words, and they worked, obviously, because it brought the thought into my mind. But I just felt like, we should add a little bit of this just in the background, bird sounds and wind and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, we don't do radio dramas.
Yeah.
We make that point often, because you would be surprised how few, how often people don't read the guidelines, and so we'll get scripts and stuff like that, that are done as if they're radio dramas, and that's not what we do. But it's really more or less coloring. It's like if the audio bits would add some would augment the fiction, rather than kind of a feeling that it's filling in for something that the author wasn't able to pull off or something.
Well, and some of the modifications, particularly with large cast, it helps to lend that sense of verisimilitude. Some of it is, okay, these are found documents. Well, if we're talking about in the story, here's a found document of a clip of audio, we should, that's a perfect opportunity to help immerse the listener even more. Like, or if it's something set on, internet forums. The story that we did last year, A Howling Dog by Nick Mamatas. That one, you've got a number of people responding on something that is very closely aligned with next door, and you've got neighbors sniping at each other. It works a whole lot better than having a number of voices rather than having one narrator try and differentiate between a half dozen voices. Because one thing we try to do is, if you've got more than about 5 characters, it's really hard to differentiate in audio, and it's really hard to differentiate in a short form, and give all those people individual personalities. But if you can pull in more voices, that's one way that's some shorthand that you can use to try and assist with something like that. Or the episode 400, the Screwfly Solution by James Tiptree, bringing in a number of other voices, since part of that is letters and part of that is news reports. Being able to pull in a number of different voices for those different parts really made that extra powerful. It's already a phenomenal story, and it was only elevated by the readers and some of the extra atmosphere that lent.
And as we finalize our stories for Artemis Rising, this is a conversation that I'm having with Tonya from Nightlight. There is a story that's got several different voices in it, and we're like, ooh, who would read this? Like, could it be adapted to audio? So it's definitely, right up there on our minds. And Tonya's like, actually, because of my work with Nightlight, I think I know this person and this person who would do a great job with these parts. And she's like, I just really passionately love this story, which I think underscores a point that I like to tell new writers. You don't necessarily have to convince the entire editorial team that your story is the best thing on earth. If you get one of us passionately loving your story, we will go to the mat and fight for it to get one of those slots.
Yeah, I mean, we there probably each of us can pull examples, over time of things, and it wasn't that the other editors hated the story, because if they hated it, then it probably wouldn't have run. But it didn't hit their buttons, but it hit each of our particular buttons, and so we had just done a tour of the catacombs of Via Montevecchi or something like that, and as I was reading that, I was just like, oh, this would sound so good in audio. I was already itching, to want to pull it off, want to convince everybody else, and it's a story in which very little happens. So, it was going to be a tough sell, but there were so many little things about it that I knew we could take advantage of the format that we have. So.
And before we hit our hour mark, do you guys want to talk about Artemis Rising? I really like that. I find that it has a lot of great stories. Do you want to? How did you come to having that idea? Because I don't remember it being always the case. And you want to talk about that a little bit?
I can talk a little bit about the history and then turn it over to Karen. Mm-hmm. We're looking at submissions right now for our 5th year of Artemis Rising, and a lot of that was started by trying to help provide a hand up to voices that have been traditionally marginalized in the publishing industry. And also trying to reach out and get, additional, getting some new voices into the market. And a lot of this was inspired by John Joseph Adams' Women Destroy project. And we were doing our part as a community member to take that mission and amplify it and grow that. and then I guess I'll and having some champions on the inside of the team. There's a number of folks who were really passionate about it and put in a whole bunch of the additional setup work to make the whole thing come off, because trying to get multiple editorial teams all pointed in the same direction at the same time is not a simple task, because all of the different podcasts have entirely separate editorial teams, and we don't, we've got no input on what Escape Pod does, and often only a vague idea of what they're doing at any given point in time. So it's we work with each other, but I couldn't tell you without going to like a contract spreadsheet to tell you what's coming up later this year on Escape Pod. Of course, except for they are doing Sarah Pinsker's, and then there was N-1, the Hugo shortlist and Yuji shortlist novella. It was fantastic. So I know that's coming up, but other than that, I don't know what else they've got planned for the rest of this year.
Karen?
No, unless she's gone.
Oh.
No, she's muted. She may be talking, but
Sorry.
There she is.
So speaking as a first of all, a submitter to Artemis Rising back in the day, and like really badly wanting to be published by PseudoPod, and then later being invited to submit to help fill a slot, and being invited as a guest editor, and now being assistant editor where I'm mentoring and helping the guest editors now. And I'm also sort of coordinating a support group for the guest editors because of what my experience as a guest editor was like. So I'm kind of super duper involved between all the different podcasts in this. But I want to speak for a second about why it was important to me that this exists. So because part of my job, I take it onto myself as this being part of my job, is to promote, hey, ladies, go ahead and submit to Artemis Rising. And this year was particularly difficult. Every year I get angry male friends and not even people I know really attacking me hardcore. And I don't, you don't know me yet, Joe, but I'm a very cuddly and nice Midwestern woman. I'm from Iowa. I grew up on a Christmas tree farm. I write creepy, scary horror where usually someone gets eaten. Okay, but that is not a thing. No one in my family will read that. Most of my friends that are, local friends will not read that. My coworkers will not read my stories, right? These are too scary. Nice farm women, Midwestern girls like me are not encouraged to write or read this stuff. So I would be in a corner, happily reading my Edgar Allan Poe because sad was my happy, and pouring over my Joyce Carol Oates back in a corner in grad school. But then people will come up to me and say, oh, but you guys have Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, and, and you've got Shirley Jackson, and women have always been in horror. Women have been in the foundations of horror. Why do you, this is my lived experience. I was never encouraged. And because I'm a humongous nerd and all of my stuff is either science fiction, fantasy, or horror, the other people in my traditional master's degree program that I did back in 2000 would just sort of do a golf clap, oh, I don't get this, right? And then when I went and got my speculative fiction, my genre fiction degree from Stone Coast, everybody in there knew exactly what I was trying to write and what I was doing. But still, when that editor came up to me at a conference and said, I'm doing an anthology, and this was not for professional pay, and this was some guy who's a cardiac nurse and happens to be a delightful human being, and he was just like, you know what, I need to get more women's voices into my anthology. I'm going to walk up to this woman at this conference who asked an interesting question and say, hey, do you want to submit? It changed my life that he came up to me and said that to me. Because then I looked at my work and I'm like, no, you write horror, girl. Hello. This is what this is why no one that wants to read your stories. This is why you feel so alone all the time. This is you. These are your people, and this is what you write. And having something like Artemis Rising, and especially a voice like me out there to other female writers and being like, hey, we are here. You have permission. Mm-hmm. You have permission to identify yourself as a horror writer. And you know what? I'll read your story. You just send your story to me, my friend. You are finding your people. And just like to try and explain that to a friend who is very angry, that he's being locked out of 1 month mm-hmm. of submitting. It's so intensely painful. I'm like, don't yell at me on Facebook because other women I'm trying to encourage and excite see your angry yelling and they go, I don't want to be part of this community. I don't want that guy to yell at me. I don't want to be in a situation where I'm going to be yelled at. Because I'm like, girl, I'm there. I know what I'm not a fighter, you guys. Like, I am a snuggly, There's a reason why my Patronus is a quokka, I don't. And so I just am trying to explain to him, like, listen, if you want to yell at me, you got to do it in private message because this is damaging to what I'm trying to do. So I don't know. It's really hard, but it's really worth it. So I want to keep doing it.
Well, and I want to build on what Karen was saying there. Another key component of the Artemis Rising project is to help make sure that the women on our team are get the opportunity to learn the ins and outs and see if the editorial end of things is something that they're interested in. Like a couple of years back, we had Chelsea Davis, one of our audio producers, approach us, said, hey, I want to do I'd like to try out some audio production. Artemis Rising was the perfect opportunity to have her, she's one of our associate editors, was reading stories for us, but Artemis Rising was the perfect opportunity to have her train underneath our audio producer, Graham Dunlop, and learn how all the ins and outs and fiddly parts of putting an episode together. And from that, she's one of our regular audio producers. We've got 2 that we trade off months. And Karen was our guest editor for Artemis Rising last year, and now she's our assistant editor. Dagny Paul, who is our Artemis Rising editor 2 years ago, is now assisting with Vasterian and helping edit that magazine. There's an opportunity to teach and learn and help pull them into the community, because mostly Shawn and I, our participation on Artemis Rising is to help catch and make everything look seamless and do all the parts that they're not interested in learning. Like, Karen wasn't interested in doing the contracting last year because she'd already done that. She knew all the ins and outs of that from having done Mothership Zeta. So Shawn and I stepped in and we took care of that piece because that was absolutely something that we already do for all the episodes. So
let's say Alex stepped in and did that. I'm terrible with that. I don't want to have anything to do with it.
So it's still an opportunity to bring more people in, and really helps to integrate them into the community.
I can speak from personal experience that I would not have had the gumption to come up to some editors that I knew and been like, hey, can I, be an editor for you for a while, like that. I would never do that. That's so scary.
Yeah.
But like, here I am hanging out at my first StokerCon, and Alex comes up to me and is like, hey, Karen, do you want to edit for, guest edit for Artemis Rising? And I'm like, oh my God, yes, but yes, okay. Like, I wouldn't, without having that invitation, and this speaks to me. Like, there are other women who are total warriors, and I love you and look up to you. I am not that. So it's just I've learned so much, and I've become so much, and I've done so much, and I just this is so good, and thank you.
Well, that's an interesting thing. I guess I hadn't even thought about it that deeply, that the sort of back end, having guest editors and using that as an opportunity for education and exposure beyond just publishing stories by women and non-binary people. That's really cool too, because that expands the web of potential publications to exist that can have all these other different stories.
Well, in general, even that's outside of Artemis Rising, that's what we hope slushing for Pseudopod can help with. Slushing is a non-fun task, but on the other hand, we try to at least, make it begin to be the structuring of an editorial mind, because you have to start making decisions. You have to start saying, this works, this doesn't. Why doesn't this work? Why doesn't this, why does this work? And how do I argue that to somebody else, and that kind of thing. So in general, we're always trying to, the people that are brought in, and at a slushing level, they're not paid, and it's a hell of a job to do. I know I did it myself, by myself, way back. It's a hell of a job to do and not get paid for. But the bonus you get out of it is you get real nitty gritty experience of the actuality of what editing something like this is. Which, anybody can call themselves an editor if they've got the money to publish a book. And I think, we've seen the outcomes of that in various cases. But it is its own skill. It is an invisible art, sadly. It's something that if you do your job well, nobody knows you did it. But hopefully at some point somebody says, hey, this place is consistently good for stories, like people keep coming back here, and in relation to that, as I've often said, I would really be surprised if there was anyone that liked every single story we ran, because between Alex and I, and me, one of the dreams I had in particular when I first started was that I was going to try to make this thing as wide ranging as possible without falling into the traps of that. And hopefully we've done that. But what that means is there's a certain, chance that there'll be a certain part of the audience that goes, geez, I didn't like that story. I'm never going to listen again. God knows why they would do that. But, so I often tell people, give us a month, give us 4 stories, and within those 4 stories, unless it happens to be a showcase month, you're gonna get the full range of everything. So, and hopefully we're passing that on to, all the people that we bring in, so they can go off and, spread the editing illness as it is.
Well, I recommend to my students that they do 6 months to a year of slush reading, because you do learn a lot. You learn a lot about what's going on in the market right then. You get to read stories that are by famous people that haven't been edited yet, and that's very educational and instructional to see what a polished, professional person submits, but yet is still not accepted. You also are seeing just the total I didn't even really care or edit the story very much before I sent it to you percentages, and you learn a lot, and it makes you braver about. Well, it made me braver to submit my own stuff.
on a granular level, I can tell you that the one thing that I don't think anyone gets out of slushing without learning is how to pace a story, because you will, have read so many stories where you're like, oh, this is a really great setup. Oh, this is a really great idea. Oh my God, this thing is just paced terribly. Like there's so much fat, or there's, and supposedly I think that that's what Flash and Drabbles and things like that were invented to do, invented to kind of, be this way of people learning to cut the fat from their stories. But honestly, read a whole bunch of flabby stories and you'll learn it, or read a whole bunch of short fiction from the 50s when all the pulp writers had to really cut back on their verbiage because the magazines were thinner, read your Richard Matheson, read your Raymond Carver, it's like these are the guys that'll tell you how to really pace and have content in the story that just gets it up and running and gets it where it needs to go without endless, dithering about what color the bookcase is or, what the sky looked like that day, so.
Well, I think that brings us to just about the end. Thank you guys so much. Instead of me trying desperately to plug 3 people, how about you guys all go around and do your plugs, and then we'll finish this out.
Karen, you want to go first?
Oh, okay. So thank you everyone for listening to us talk about these issues. I can be found at KarenBovenmyer.com, which is just a gateway really to my social media presence. And I love to continue to have conversations like this on my Facebook page or via Twitter. You can also come visit us at the Escape Artists Forum and talk about stories with different escape artists podcast people, which include pseudopodians or pseudopodians. I'm not sure which one we go by.
Tentacles.
But, my creative work can also be found through LinkedIn.
Who's next?
Alex, you go.
I'm just going to. I'm just an editor, so I'm going to plug. Thanks for listening to this. Go check out a number of stories from Pseudopod. There is a convenient new to Pseudopod list of 13 recommended stories that show kind of the whole range of what we do, and. Also encourage everybody to go over and subscribe to Nightlight, the Black Horror Fiction podcast. They just ran a Cherie Renee Thomas story that's fantastic, and the Linda Addison one warms my heart. So totally worth checking them out.
All right, and I'm Shawn Garrett. I was the editor that took over after Ben, and I don't have a big web presence, although I am on the forums and check those out occasionally, and also the Facebook Pseudopod Listeners group, if you feel so inclined, where I post a lot of my book reviews and movie reviews. I spend an inordinate amount of time reading short fiction, especially of all types, but obviously horror and supernatural. And I guess, as always, I just want to dedicate everything I do on the show to my sister Susan, who passed away in 2010, and almost immediately after that was when Ben asked me if I wanted to take over editing, so I did.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this conversation as much as I enjoyed being a part of it. If you want to learn more about Pseudopod, the website is pseudopod.org. There's a link in the show notes. Please go on and click on it, subscribe, and enjoy all of the wonderful horror stories therein. If you want to email the show, you can do so at noisemakerjoe@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at noisemakerjoe. Until next time, write more and write better.